Chapters 2 and 3 here in the book of 2 Thessalonians. And if you recall some of the studies that we've had in 1 Thessalonians, and also, I guess last week did the first chapter of 2 Thessalonians, a lot of the discussion revolves around the second coming of Christ. And tonight will be no different. There's some other additional information, I guess you could say, that Paul offers us there. And we'll study a little bit about that in just a moment. Now, question number 1 on your handout is the question: if you were convinced that the world would end in 6 months, what would you do?
Look for a second opinion.
Okay. Look for a second opinion. Okay, well, I didn't expect that answer, but I guess you're entitled to your own answer. So, what if you knew in 6 months all this was going to pass away? Do you think you'd live your life any differently than how you lived it today? Yeah, I think we would. You know, I was thinking, anybody got any big projects going?
Right? I'm not building a ark or anything, but I think we always have something going on, don't we?
Yeah. Well, what kind of perspective would we have on that project if we knew in 6 months it was all going to be over with anyway? I'd say we'd probably just say, well, I don't care about that, too much anymore. We might decide we work too much. We might be deciding, well, we're spending way too much time with our job. How about anybody have any family they'd like to talk to? Yeah, I think probably all of us have something along that. Spiritually, is there anything that you change with your life? Think you might read the Bible more, maybe pray a little bit more, or think there might be a few changes? I would say probably all of us, if we were honest, would say, yeah, there's some things that would change if we knew that in 6 months this world was going to end. I bring that up because that's kind of the context in which Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica. They thought the world was coming to an end. And so they had changed their lifestyle to fit their beliefs. And they basically, what we glean is a lot of them, they thought, well, we'll quit working, we'll quit doing anything. We're just going to sit here and wait because the Lord's coming back pretty soon. And so there were a lot of changes in their ordinary day lives. And of course, like we mentioned here with that first question, we can kind of understand that. If our belief was the world was going to end pretty quickly, then there'd probably be a lot of changes that occur within our life. So let's go to chapter 2 here. That's where we're going to start tonight. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the information that Paul offers concerning the second coming of Christ. If I can get somebody to read, let's read the first 4 verses here in 2 Thessalonians 2.
Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by the gathering together unto him, that ye be not soon shaken in mind, nor be troubled, neither in spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that a man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God.
Okay, so question number 2 on your handout is, what is the subject that Paul's addressing? What does he start addressing in this chapter here? Yeah, the coming of Jesus, and obviously he's writing about the return of Christ. Jesus coming back in judgment on the world. And there's 3 things that he really mentions here in verse 2. Basically, he was telling them, calm down. They were under this impression and belief that, Christ was coming back immediately. So it had them shaken, it had their minds stirred up, and they weren't acting like they should have been acting. So Paul's trying to get them to calm down, and he says, listen, don't allow your spirit to be troubled, or don't allow your faith or your mind to be shaken. He mentions 3 different things here. The first one is either by spirit. What do you mean by that? Yeah, it's probably, how did the church receive God's word in the first century? Well, it came through revelation, didn't it? They didn't have a written down form like we have in the New Testament. But it came through prophets, it came through apostles, it came through preachers who were endowed by the Holy Spirit with miraculous gifts to preach and to teach God's Word. These men obviously received revelations from God. And so it seems like maybe somewhere along the line somebody said, well, the Spirit told me, that Jesus is coming back very soon. And so Paul says, don't be troubled by spirit, as if the day of Christ is at hand. The second thing that he mentions there, of course, is by word. What would that be? Yeah, maybe somebody's out there teaching it, right? Jesus is coming back soon, and here's how I know this. Or maybe somebody said, well, I heard Paul say, that the return of Christ is going to happen really soon. And so he says, don't allow that. You hear something like that, don't be troubled. Don't be shaken in mind as if the day of the Lord is at hand. And then the third thing that he mentions there is what?
By letter as from us.
Yeah, by letter as from us. So what's kind of the deduction that you get from that, reading that statement?
It seems like he's referring to letters from other people who are spreading the word. Although when I first read it, I wonder if there were people, for lack of a better term, forging letters in Paul's name.
Yeah, that almost is the impression that you get, isn't it?
That would be really effective if you were trying to spread something other than what Paul said. It's like his name on Paul.
Yeah, so if you got a letter that said from the Apostle Paul, right, and it said, the day of the Lord is at hand, Jesus is coming back soon, well, that would be a cause for concern. So Paul's telling them, don't be troubled as if you get a letter from us that Christ is coming back. Better than that. Just calm down about the situation. So he points out there were some things, we talked about how as far as the day and the hour and the time, the exact time of Christ's return, no man knows that. But evidently there was some revelation that was given to the early church and to the apostles that Jesus was not going to return until certain things had taken place. And that's really what Paul is emphasizing here in the first part of this chapter. So what does he say has to happen in verse 3 there before the day of the Lord will come?
Falling away.
Yeah, there's really two things that are mentioned there. The first one is the falling away, right? So evidently, and this is one of those discussions, some people think they know exactly what it is, and some people say it could be this, and some people say I have no idea. So it's one of those things that, I think there's pretty good evidence for some events that had happened in the past, but there was going to be a falling away. The church was going to fall away. And it had to be, for Paul to write about this, it had to be on a measurable scale, I would say, or a universal scale, maybe is a better way to say it. In other words, it's not, like in one little place over here in some foreign city that the church fell away. I think it was more the idea, it was kind of this universal or worldwide falling away or apostasy that would take place. So Paul says, we know that's going to happen before the day of the Lord comes. Well, how do you know that? There's only be one way that he would know that, right? It had to be revealed to him by God. And he mentions in this chapter, he'd already spoken to the church at Thessalonica about this very issue. He'd already had this discussion with them before. So the first thing that has to happen was the falling away. What's the second thing?
Man of sin revealed.
Yeah, the man of sin or the man of lawlessness, that's literally the meaning of the word there. The man of lawlessness has to be revealed. He's also called the son of perdition there in verse 3. And so one of the discussions, or one of the major discussions that usually takes place around 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is, what is the great falling away? And who is the man of sin or the man of lawlessness? And so I'm just gonna throw the baton out there, and somebody can pick it up and run with it if they want. Does anybody have an opinion or an interpretation?
I have an opinion of talking about the 10 kings.
Okay.
That Daniel talks about there in verse 25.
Okay. Okay, that's a pretty prominent teaching. Obviously the Roman Catholic Church split off from the Church of Christ. And that happened, somewhere around 300 years after Jesus died or somewhere in that neighborhood. And there was a great falling away that took place at that time. There were a lot of people who were influenced by that. A lot of people turned away from the gospel and the truth to Roman Catholicism. And then to kind of go hand in hand with that, if that be the proper application of it, then the man of sin or the man of lawlessness has been identified as the Pope. And there's a couple reasons why that's the case. Let's look. Well, did you have a comment? Who did I miss? Go ahead.
I think I'm skipping ahead, but verse 4 is defining this person, and it has to match our interpretation, or we've got it wrong.
Right, and it's I don't say that it's necessarily an individual, maybe as much as an office in and of itself, because what is revealed is, if you go ahead and you read the rest of that chapter, that particular person is not going to be destroyed until Christ returns. Well, if it's an individual and a human being, they'd have to live an awfully long time, right? So I think it has to do with reference with more of an office than an individual in and of itself. And so, like Adam said, if you look at the description of this man in verse 4, this is why a lot of people believe that it is the Pope himself. But it says, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And so this man of lawlessness is going to oppose God. And, Roman Catholicism, a lot of teachings that enter into it, but there are a lot of teachings within Roman Catholicism that are exactly the opposite of what God's law and the gospel teaches. And so it's important to keep that in mind. But he exalts himself above everything that is called God, and he sets himself above everything else when it comes to worship. Well, what other person in history can you think of that would describe?
It's pre-Christ, but the pharaohs were very much exalted as a god above all gods.
Yeah.
I have a question though. When it mentions sitting in the temple of God, and obviously I have no idea what the original language says, but what do you know? Because when it says temple of God, normally they're referring to, something basically that was built by the Jews.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that was relevant. And as far as being exalted above God and stuff, I'm sure I very easily be wrong, but I've always thought that it would be a charismatic leader that would basically do what Hitler did.
Yeah, and that's...
Unite a nation. Well, I mean, lots of people have said, oh, Hitler was the Antichrist. Hitler was the Antichrist. I mean, obviously he wasn't because he was defeated.
Yeah.
But that some unifying entity that comes off as, oh, look, we're unity, we're together, and then ends up with so much power that they get worshipped like the pharaohs did.
Yeah, and that's a pretty prominent view in the religious world today. That sometime in our future, a key individual is going to arise where basically everybody pledges allegiance to him and follows him. And there's some interesting things about that concept. I don't know how far I want to chase it, but the thing that I want you to keep in mind is, when is this guy going to be destroyed? When the Son of Man is revealed, right? And so it's not somebody who's already passed away off the scene, right? Because he's not going to be destroyed until Christ returns. And again, if it's an individual, then we would have to believe that it's going to be somewhere toward the end of time, right? If he's not going to pass away until Christ returns. If it's an office, though, then you can understand that a little bit differently. You can understand that it's going to last until whenever Christ is revealed or returns to the earth. But if you think about verse 4, that is a pretty good description of the Pope, isn't it? I mean, he exalts himself above all that is God and everything that is worshipped. He sits in the temple of God, which is either a reference, like you said, the original language doesn't indicate whether we're talking about a physical temple or a spiritual. Now, are we talking about the physical temple that the Jews built, or are we talking about the church? Because that's where Catholicism came out of, and that's basically what the Pope did. He set himself up in the church as God. And so, if it is him, again, it's a pretty good description. He's portraying himself. He's claiming that he himself is God, the latter part of verse 4. So it's an interesting, it's an interesting discussion and study. And what I really wish is, I wish I had the discussion that Paul had with the church at Thessalonica, because we would understand it a little bit better. But he does, where does he point that out? In verse 5 there, he does say, do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? That's why he doesn't go into it and elaborate upon it, and explain it a whole lot. He says, I've already had this discussion with you. Just remember the things that we talked about. Do you have a comment?
No.
Okay, I thought I saw a hand. Sorry. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, is this the same as the Antichrist that
Well, that's another-
1st, 2nd, 3rd John?
Yeah, it's another good question, isn't it? Is that a key figure, or is it a spirit, or, what is it?
That he says is already there.
Yeah.
In 1st John.
Yeah, the spirit of the Antichrist was already at work. And even when he's writing this, he's talking about how this particular guy or office is being restrained. So once again, if it's an individual, if he was being restrained right then in AD, what are we, 50-something? How long is God going to restrain him? How long is he living here? Is he still alive today? Well, how's he going to be destroyed when Christ returns then, if he's already died?
And doesn't Jesus himself refer to Judas as the son of perdition?
Yes, he does. And that was a pretty, well, I won't say it was a common phrase, but it was a descriptive phrase, because what does the word perdition mean? Anybody know?
Man.
Yeah, it's just destruction. You think about Judas. Judas was the son of destruction, wasn't he? I mean, everything that he did was bad stuff. And so it's kind of the idea this guy's bad news. Everything that he has to do with has to deal with deceit. It has to deal with glorifying himself, magnifying himself, things like that. So it's a phrase, that was used before of Judas, but it's obviously not talking about Judas, because Judas has long since died since this letter has been written. Do you have a comment?
Well, we're not going to know this one, but another thought just popped in my mind is, what if it's neither an individual nor an office, but just a way of looking at the world? Like humanism is on the rise, and scientism, and that exalts itself over God and takes control of the church and all that, does all those things.
Yeah.
And, just another.
Yeah, and like I said, to me, personally, I think the best description that we have right now is the Catholic Church and the Pope. Now, there might be events in the future that change my mind about that, but as far as me just looking at it from a historical perspective and, taking what little we have here that Paul says and applying it, to me, that's the best fit. But there are a lot of other ideas out there, and the important thing is not to get wrapped up, I think, in all the details, because that's not really, why was Paul writing this? What was the main point that he's trying to make?
Get these people on with life.
Yeah, Christ is not coming yet, and he hasn't come. So don't be upset, calm down. There's some things that have to take place. We know, God's revealed this to us, there's some things that have to take place before Christ is going to return, and they haven't taken place yet. So don't get bent out of shape as if, it's the day of the Lord is right around the corner. Yes, sir.
If you were a Christian after Caesar instituted the Roman Catholic Church, and you're reading this letter then in 300 whatever AD, might be freaking out a little bit.
Yeah.
You're thinking, this is falling away, this is the dude, he's coming back.
Yeah,
It's been
and
1700 years.
yeah, and that's really the point here. Paul isn't saying, when you see these things, it's here. You know, that's not the point that he's making. He's saying these have to happen before Christ returns. Now, how long after will Christ return when these things happen? We have no idea. Right? We're right back to square one here. That day, that hour, no man knows, right? 1,700 years, 2,000 years, 10 years, we don't know. That's not the point that Paul's making. The point is, he just knew, and the early church knew, there were some things that had to happen before Christ was going to return. And so they hadn't happened, at least at the time that he's writing here, they hadn't happened yet. And so his message is, you're not going to know when Christ is going to come. Again, what's the timeline for Christ's return after these things happen? Your guess is as good as mine. I mean, we have no idea. We have no biblical revelation or information. And so the main point that he's making there is, how do you prepare yourself for the coming of Jesus?
Get ready every day.
Yeah. Do you sit around and try to figure out the date and the time? Is that how you're going to be prepared? No, it's by living like you're supposed to live every day of your life, right? And then it doesn't matter when Christ returns, because whenever he returns, we're going to be ready for that. But it is an interesting discussion. And like I said, we could spend all night probably talking about it and not get anywhere, because we don't have all the information that we need to make, I think, the proper judgment. But there are some ideas, and kind of take those home and study them for yourself. And like we always say, believe something because you studied it out and you found the information. Don't just believe it because somebody else tells you that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about people who are going to perish here. Somebody read verses 10 through 12 for us.
For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not...
Get us back in chapter 2 there, will you please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're fine. I want chapter 3, but we're not going that fast yet.
It's on the wrong page. 11 and 12. 10, 11. And with all divisiveness, deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie.
Okay, so why are people going to perish, right? He talks about this lawless one who's going to come in verse 9, according to the working of Satan, all power, signs, lying, wonders. And then some people are going to be deceived, right? So why would God destroy them? What did they not have? They didn't have a love for the truth, right? And that's a good lesson for us as Christians, especially. But we need to understand. We need to be willing to accept the truth, and we have to hold on to it because it is the truth. We don't have any other. If we reject the truth, what's the only thing left? There's only two things. There's the truth, and what's the other? A lie, right? Deception, error. Those are the two choices that we have. We can either believe the truth or we can believe a lie. But we're going to believe one or the other, aren't we? These people did not have a love for the truth. They didn't accept the truth. They didn't obey the truth. In fact, they delighted in wickedness. I think one of the statements that's made there. But they allowed themselves to be deceived. Was the truth there? Is the truth here today? Yeah. Does that mean that everybody's going to accept it? No. Some people are going to choose to believe a lie rather than believe the truth, right? And that's what's going to lead to their being lost. I mean, that's why they're going to perish. And so you have the deceiver. I mean, you have the person who's responsible for leading them astray. But you also have to say there was a willingness within them to let go of the truth. They didn't want to accept it. They didn't want to believe it. And so they chose to believe the deceiver or the lie instead. Go ahead, Dennis. You got a comment?
Well, it just will say verse 11 is one of the scariest verses there is in the Bible. That for this reason, God's going to send them. And he said kind of the same thing back in Romans.
Yeah.
Let it go. And they're scary verses.
Yeah, basically it says that, God's going to send error their way. If God presents me the truth, I mean, think about with Adam and Eve. Okay, God laid the truth down, presented to him. You can't get any clearer than what it was. Did he allow Satan to come along and propagate error? Yeah, he did. Now, God wasn't responsible for the error. He's not the one who came up with it. He wasn't the one trying to propagate it. But he allowed Satan to do that, didn't he? And it's no different today. I mean, the truth is here. God's done everything within his power to present the truth to us. If I don't want to believe the truth, is he going to allow somebody to come my way and tell me something different? You bet he is. He's not going to come down here and make us believe and accept the truth. And so you have this idea, if we don't have any love for the truth, if we don't have a desire to be saved, then God's going to let us do whatever we want to do, right? We want to believe a lie, God's going to let us believe a lie. And ultimately, that's going to lead, of course, to our destruction. So this falling away in this man was going to lead people away from the truth. That's part of the point that Paul is making here. And people were going to be turning away from the truth because they didn't love it. They didn't accept it. They didn't want to be saved. They'd rather believe a lie than believe what God told them, the truth. And God said, I'm going to allow it. I'm going to allow people to lead them astray. If that's what they want, if that's what they want to hear, then that's what they're going to hear. So he reads the rest of chapter 2 deals with the idea of standing firm. And I want to kind of get to the end here in chapter 3, so I'm going to rush through some of these. But you read about how God chose the Thessalonian Christians for salvation. When did he do that? Question 7 there. Yeah, that's how he did it, right? But when did God come up with this plan? Men to be saved, men to be lost. It was in the beginning, wasn't it? It was before the foundations. Paul writes about in Ephesians 1:4. It was before the foundations of the world were even laid. And there's this teaching within the Bible. It's called predestination. And the Bible does teach the idea of predestination. It doesn't teach individual predestination, where God just arbitrarily picked this guy to be saved and this guy to be lost. But here's what God did predestine before the world ever began. Those who believe and love the truth are going to be saved. Those who reject the truth, those who have no love for the truth, they're going to be destroyed. The Thessalonian Christians were part of those who were chosen to be saved, according to the plan of God. And so all those who love the truth and believe and obey are going to be saved. Those who do not are going to be lost. That was God's plan from the beginning. God calls us to salvation. Question number 8 here. How does he do that? What's the instrument or the means through which he calls us? How did God tell you to be saved? Gospel, right? That's the way he calls us to salvation. We're set apart by the teachings of the Spirit, belief in the truth. Paul talked about, some oral teachings and letters that he was using to help send instruction to the church there. He also, when you get into chapter 3, he requests for the prayers of the church. He talks about how the Thessalonian Christians had seen the gospel as an honorable, a glorious thing. Paul was in Corinth. Remember, when he was writing this epistle, Paul was in Corinth. And read about some of the things that happened to Paul in Corinth. Not every person saw the gospel as something glorious, did they? And so he was praying for them to pray that men would see the glory of the gospel of Christ. It wouldn't be hindered. He wanted to be delivered from unreasonable and wicked men. Why would people oppose the gospel? Okay, think about some of the concepts that are taught within the gospel. What are some of those concepts?
Deny self.
Okay, deny self. Yeah, I was thinking of a more positive thing, though. I was thinking like, love and joy and peace and eternal life. You think those are good things? Sound pretty good to me, don't they? Yeah. Why would people oppose things like that?
A lot of them wouldn't love their neighbor as themselves.
Yeah.
And that's a big order to fill.
Yeah, and it has to do, I think, with what Dennis was talking about there, because it comes at a cost, doesn't it? And that's denying yourself. That's putting yourself on the back burner. A lot of people don't want to do that, do they? I mean, they want to be they want to focus on them. They want, to do everything that they want to do. They want to be the one calling the shots. They want to be the one in charge. And Christianity isn't like that. So some people don't appreciate it. Some people don't like it. Yes, sir. No, I'm seeing hands, I guess. You just your fingers tingling, or what? Okay. All right, sorry. I'll try not to call on you again. Paul had great confidence in the church at Thessalonica, though, that they were doing what God commanded them to do, and they would continue to do that. And then in the end of chapter 3, you have this warning against the idleness. Remember, I told you kind of the idea behind what was going on here. These people believed that Christ was coming back soon. So it appears like they just stopped doing anything. They said, well, there's no need for us to work anymore. Christ is coming back soon. It's not going to help us in this world. So it appears they've become idle. And they become lazy, and they become involved in a lot of people's business. And so Paul writes about some of those things here in the end of this chapter. He talks about the work habits that he set as an example for them while he was at Thessalonica. The world today, the world is full of people who slack off. Do you agree with that? I think it's full of people who try to do as little as possible. Or people who only try to work when they see the boss coming. That's not the mindset of a Christian. Or it's not supposed to be the mindset of a Christian. How often did Paul work while he's at the church at Thessalonica? He said night and day. He wasn't lazy. I mean, even when he had the opportunity, even when he had the right to demand support from the church at Thessalonica, he chose to go ahead and to work. And as Christians, nobody should look at us and say, they're lazy. A lazy Christian is not a follower of Christ. And so we need to be people who are industrious. We need to be people who are work. And of course, even when Paul had the opportunity for support, he denied that and worked. And there's a couple of reasons why Paul points out that we should do that. Number one, if we don't, we become a burden to other people, don't we? There's a lot of things in our society that people label as being free. There's nothing free. It may be free to you, but it costs somebody else something. And so if we aren't industrious and we aren't involved and we aren't out there working, we become a burden to other people. People have to support us. The second thing is, as Christians, we want to do as much good as we can in this world. And one of the ways that we can do that is by supporting ourselves and having the ability to support other people too, through our work habits. And then, of course, number 3 is to serve and to glorify God. Paul gave a rule or a command about working and eating. What was that? Verse 10. Yeah, basically, if you're not going to work, if you're going to refuse to work, then you've given up your right to eat. You're going to lose your right to eat. And that's not talking about a person who's disabled. It's not talking about a person who doesn't have the physical capability to work. It's not talking about a person who's genuinely out there trying to find work, but there is no work to be found. That's not even the principle that Paul's being addressed here. It's the idea of people who have the ability and the opportunity to work and they just don't want to do it. And so if a person is like that, the command is they shouldn't be offered anything to eat, right? They're not willing to work. Some of these people, question 15, they become busybodies. What does that mean?
Gossipers.
Yeah, they were poking around in other people's affairs, weren't they? They were tattling about who was doing what. They were gossiping about everything that was going on. Paul says, get back to work. You guys got too much time on your hand. A person who's an industrious person doesn't have a lot of time to poke into other people's affairs or, tattle or gossip. And then question 16 is here, what should we do with people who don't obey these instructions? Pat them on the back and say, good job, right? Yeah. Church discipline is what's being discussed there. Discipline them, right? Personally. Withdraw from them. But don't treat them like an enemy. That's not the goal, right? You're not trying to destroy them in any way. You're trying to help. You're trying to get them to see what's going on in their life and to turn that around. So, talk to them, admonish them, warn them like you would your own family. So, good lessons for us in this chapter. I know we had to blaze through there, and I know chapter 2, the first part of it, we could spend probably a month talking about it, and like I said, we wouldn't get anywhere at the end, but it is good study. Go home, study these things out for yourself, form your own ideas and opinions and beliefs, and that will help you a great deal. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or anything before we end tonight? Yes, sir.
I have a question. In chapter 2, verse 11, when you were discussing it, you kept mentioning, would he allow someone to come and feed you a lie that you might believe if you did accept the truth? At least in my translation, which is King James, it says he would send them a strong delusion. And to me, that sounds like, well, if you're not really going to pay attention, wind and chaff. I'll send something to the ones who aren't going to listen anyway. I'm going to send something that'll go ahead and make it a clear cut.
Yeah, the important thing that I want to emphasize is God's not the author of error. God is always pushing and pulling for man to be saved. That's his goal. And so he's not going to try to get somebody to disobey the gospel. But if somebody does not want to accept the truth, is God going to allow that? Yeah, read there's a good story. I had one written down here. We didn't have time. Read 1 Kings chapter 22 about a prophet by the name of Micaiah. And he goes to Ahab and he tells Ahab, if you go to battle, you're going to die. He tells him the truth. The problem is Ahab didn't want to hear that. And so all of his other prophets tell him, God says, go up, go fight this, you're going to win. And there's a discussion that takes place there. God said, who's going to go for me? Who's going to talk to Ahab? And there's a spirit that says, I'll go and I'll lie. And God says, okay, go. And again, you have that concept. Did God lie? No. God wasn't the one who was propagating the error, but he allowed it. He allows Satan to propagate error. He allows other people to teach error because he's presented us the truth. So it's a good thought and process. Maybe that'll help a little bit in understanding it. Anybody else?